In 1898, the United States fought a short war against Spain and emerged with overseas territories for the first time in its history. That conflict marked a turning point. Good evening. Tonight, we will follow the rise of the United States as a global superpower, from the Spanish-American War to the present day. Step B. Step examining the key wars, political decisions, economic expansions, and strategic doctrines that transformed a continental republic into a dominant international force. We will begin with the Spanish-American War and the acquisition of territories such as Puerto Rico and the Philippines. From there, we will examine America's role in World War I and how it shifted the balance of power in Europe. We will move through the Great Depression and World War II, analyzing how industrial mobilization positioned the United States at the center of global reconstruction. Then, we will follow the Cold War containment, nuclear deterrence, Korea, Vietnam, and the arms race, before turning to the post-Cold War era, the war on terror, economic globalization, and the challenges of maintaining influence in the 21st century. This is not mythology or patriotic rhetoric. It is a chronological examination of how military capability, economic power, geography, ideology, and strategic decisions combine to elevate the United States into a global superpower. Few nations have transitioned so rapidly from regional influence to worldwide presence. How did this happen in just over a century? If you value long-form, structured historical analysis, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps support deep documentary-style studies like this one. In the comments, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there, and which moment you believe most decisively launched America onto the global stage. We begin in 1898, when the United States stepped beyond its continental borders. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had completed its continental expansion. The frontier, officially declared closed in 1890 by the U.S. Census Bureau, symbolized the end of westward territorial growth within North America. For decades, American focus had been inward. Industrialization, railroad expansion, urban growth, and consolidation after the Civil War. However, economic production was now exceeding domestic demand. Industrial output in steel, oil, and manufactured goods surged dramatically. This mattered because economic expansion required new markets. As American factories produced more than the domestic market could absorb, policymakers and business leaders began looking outward. Simultaneously, strategic thinking evolved. Naval officer Alfred Thayer Mahon published The Influence of Sea Power upon History in 1890, arguing that national greatness depended on strong naval capacity in overseas bases. His ideas gained traction among policymakers, including future President Theodore Roosevelt. This mattered because it reframed American security in global terms. Instead of protecting coastlines alone, the United States would need coaling stations, naval ports, and strategic positions abroad. The immediate catalyst for overseas intervention came from Cuba. By the 1890s, Cuba was fighting for independence from Spain. American newspapers, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, amplified reports of Spanish brutality. Sensationalist journalism, often referred to as yellow journalism, inflamed public opinion. The explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898 intensified tensions. Though the exact cause of the explosion remains debated by historians, public sentiment quickly blamed Spain. This mattered because political pressure mounted rapidly. War became increasingly likely, not only for strategic reasons, but also due to public demand. In April 1898, Congress declared war on Spain. The conflict was brief, but decisive. In the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. Within hours, in the Caribbean, U.S. forces landed in Cuba. Theodore Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, resigned to lead the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry unit that gained fame during the Battle of San Juan Hill. While popular, memory often highlights this engagement. The broader strategic picture was clear. Spanish naval resistance collapsed quickly. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, formally ended the war. Spain relinquished control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States, while Cuba became a U.S. protectorate. Under the Platt Amendment, this marked a fundamental shift. For the first time, the United States possessed overseas territories far from the North American mainland. This mattered because the nation transitioned from continental expansion to overseas empire. The annexation of the Philippines sparked domestic debate. Anti-imperialists argued that colonial rule contradicted American principles of self-determination. Supporters claimed strategic necessity and economic opportunity. The Philippine-American War followed, lasting from 1899 to 1902. As Filipino forces resisted U.S. control, this conflict demonstrated that overseas expansion would involve long-term commitments and moral complexity. By the end of this period, the United States had secured naval footholds in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. The country was no longer merely a continental power. It had entered global geopolitics. The next phase would test whether this new posture would remain limited or expand further as global conflicts intensified. The conclusion of the Spanish-American War did not simply add territories to the United States. It altered the nation's strategic posture permanently. Control of Puerto Rico placed the United States in a dominant position within the Caribbean. Guam offered a Pacific coaling station linking Hawaii to Asia. The Philippines extended American presence deep into the Western Pacific, near China's growing markets. This mattered because geography became global rather than regional. American security considerations now spanned oceans. The annexation of Hawaii in 1898, during the same period, reinforced this transition. Hawaii had previously been an independent kingdom with strong American commercial influence. Its annexation provided a critical naval base at Pearl Harbor. Without Hawaii, sustained naval projection into the Pacific would have been difficult. This mattered because logistical capability defines global power. A navy requires bases, supply lines, and refueling stations to operate effectively. President William McKinley justified expansion partly on economic and strategic grounds, but also in ideological terms. He argued that the United States had a duty to civilize and Christianize certain territories, language reflecting broader imperial attitudes of the era. This perspective aligned with European imperial expansion occurring at the same time. The late 19th century was dominated by competition among major powers for colonial territory. Britain, France, Germany, and Japan were expanding aggressively. The United States entered this competition relatively late. This mattered because remaining isolated risked exclusion from global trade networks and strategic positions. The construction of the Panama Canal further demonstrated the shift towards sustained global engagement. After supporting Panama's independence from Colombia in 1900, the United States secured rights to build and control the canal zone. Completed in 1914, the canal dramatically shortened naval transit between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This mattered because it allowed rapid fleet redeployment, a key advantage in global conflict scenarios. Control of the canal symbolized America's capacity to shape hemispheric affairs directly. The Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, announced in 1904, expanded U.S. influence in Latin America. Originally, the Monroe Doctrine warned European powers against interfering in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt's interpretation added that the United States itself would intervene to stabilize countries facing financial instability or political disorder. This policy led to multiple interventions in the Caribbean and Central America. This mattered because the United States was no longer simply defending its hemisphere from external powers. It was actively managing regional stability. However, expansion brought challenges. Governing overseas territories required administrative systems and military presence. The Philippine-American War demonstrated the cost of suppressing resistance. Debates over citizenship rights for territorial populations continued for decades. Supreme Court decisions known as the Insular Cases ruled that full constitutional rights did not automatically extend to all territories. This established a complex legal framework that persists in certain territories today. This mattered because empire reshaped American constitutional interpretation. By the early 20th century, the United States had developed the infrastructure of global engagement. Overseas bases, naval strength, hemispheric intervention doctrine, and economic expansion into foreign markets. Yet it had not fully committed to shaping European power balances. That moment would arrive with World War I. The next act will examine how the United States moved from cautious observer to decisive participant in a global conflict that reshaped international order. When World War I began in 1914, the United States did not immediately enter the conflict. President Woodrow Wilson declared neutrality, reflecting both public opinion and long-standing American reluctance to become entangled in European power struggles. For over a century, U.S. foreign policy had emphasized avoiding permanent alliances in Europe. This mattered because the nation had only recently begun expanding overseas, and direct participation in a continental war would represent a deeper commitment to global power politics. Despite official neutrality, economic ties quickly aligned the United States with the Allied powers, particularly Britain and France. American banks extended large loans to Allied governments. American industries supplied weapons, food, and raw materials. As a result, U.S. economic stability became increasingly tied to an Allied victory. This mattered because economic interdependence created strategic interest. A defeat of Britain and France would have endangered American financial investments and trade networks. Germany's strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare escalated tensions. German U-boats targeted Allied shipping, including vessels carrying American passengers and goods. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed 128 Americans, intensified public anger. Although the United States did not declare war at that point, Germany's submarine policy remained a persistent source of tension. This mattered because maritime commerce was essential to American economic growth. Threats to shipping lanes directly challenged U.S. interests. The turning point came in early 1917. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, calculating that it could defeat Britain before the United States mobilized. At the same time, the British intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. The telegram suggested that Mexico could recover territories lost in the Mexican-American War if Germany won. When the telegram became public, it shifted American opinion decisively. This mattered because it transformed the conflict from distant European war into direct national threat. In April 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. He framed the conflict as a defense of democratic principles, stating that the world must be made safe for democracy. The United States entered the war, not merely as a supplier, but as a combatant. Mobilization followed rapidly. The Selective Service Act instituted conscription. American factories shifted to war production. The American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John J. Pershing, deployed to Europe in increasing numbers throughout 1917 and 1918. American troops played a decisive role in the final year of the war. Fresh manpower bolstered exhausted Allied forces. Battles such as the Musargan Offensive contributed significantly to breaking German lines. By November 1918, Germany sought an armistice. The entry of the United States accelerated the end of the conflict. This mattered because American intervention shifted the balance of power in Europe. For the first time, the United States had decisively influenced the outcome of a major European war. World War I marked a psychological shift. The United States demonstrated its capacity to project military force across the Atlantic at scale. It proved capable of mobilizing industrial power rapidly and influencing global political outcomes. However, the post-war settlement would reveal tension between global responsibility and domestic reluctance. The next part will examine the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations debate, and the temporary retreat from global engagement that followed. When the fighting ended in November 1918, the United States faced a new question. How deeply should it shape the post-war world? President Woodrow Wilson traveled to Europe personally, becoming the first sitting U.S. president to do so. His presence at the Paris Peace Conference symbolized the country's elevated international status. Wilson arrived with a vision, articulated in his 14 points, advocating open diplomacy, national reduction of trade barriers, and the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. This mattered because it signaled that the United States was not merely a military participant, but an architect of a new international order. However, the peace negotiations reflected competing priorities among the Allied powers. France, having suffered extensive devastation on its territory, demanded severe reparations and security guarantees against Germany. Britain sought to preserve its naval dominance and imperial interests. Wilson's idealistic framework encountered resistance from leaders focused on immediate security and political realities. The resulting Treaty of Versailles imposed heavy reparations on Germany and redrew European borders, while it included the creation of the League of Nations. Many of Wilson's broader principles were that this mattered because the peace settlement combined punitive measures with institutional innovation, creating a fragile balance. The most significant test of American commitment came at home. The U.S. Senate was required to ratify the treaty, including membership in the League of Nations. Opposition emerged quickly, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and other critics who feared the League. Membership would compromise American sovereignty. Article 10 of the League Covenant required members to defend one another against aggression. Critics argued that this obligation could entangle the United States in future wars without congressional approval. This mattered because it revealed enduring tension between international engagement and constitutional independence. Despite Wilson's efforts, the Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The United States never joined the League of Nations. Instead, it signed separate peace treaties with Germany and Austria. This decision marked a partial retreat from the global leadership role the country had briefly embraced. Although American economic influence remained strong, formal political participation in collective security arrangements was limited. This mattered because the United States had demonstrated military capacity, but hesitated to institutionalize long-term commitments. The 1920s reflected this ambivalence. The United States became the world's largest creditor nation. American banks financed European reconstruction. Industrial production and consumer markets expanded rapidly. At the same time, immigration restrictions tightened, and isolationist sentiment grew. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922 sought to limit naval armaments among major powers, indicating continued interest in stability without permanent alliances. This mattered because the United States attempted to influence global balance through selective agreements, rather than full institutional engagement. The failure of the League of Nations to enforce peace effectively during the 1930s would later highlight the consequences of limited American participation. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, and when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League lacked enforcement power. The United States remained outside the organization and relied primarily on diplomatic protest and economic sanctions. This mattered because it demonstrated that global leadership requires sustained institutional commitment, not merely military intervention during crises. World War I had propelled the United States onto the global stage, but the interwar years revealed uncertainty about how to sustain that position. The next phase, marked by economic collapse and the rise of authoritarian regimes, would force the United States to reconsider its stance once again. The global position the United States had achieved after World War I was soon tested by economic collapse. In October 1929, the stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression. What began as financial instability quickly spread through the banking system, industrial production, and employment markets. By 1933, unemployment had reached approximately 25%. Industrial output had fallen dramatically. International trade contracted as countries imposed tariffs and protective barriers. This mattered because economic capacity underpins global influence. A nation struggling internally cannot project power externally with consistency. President Herbert Hoover initially relied on voluntary cooperation and limited federal intervention, but the scale of the crisis overwhelmed existing mechanisms. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt assumed the presidency and launched the New Deal, a series of programs aimed at stabilizing banks, creating jobs, and reforming financial systems. While these measures focused primarily on domestic recovery, they indirectly affected global posture. Economic stabilization would eventually restore industrial capacity, which later proved critical during World War II. This mattered because recovery from the Depression laid the groundwork for renewed global engagement. During the 1930s, However, American foreign policy reflected strong isolationist sentiment. The memory of World War I casualties and disillusionment with the Treaty of Versailles shaped public opinion. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts between 1935 and 1937, restricting arms sales and loans to belligerent nations. These laws were designed to prevent the economic entanglements that many believed had drawn the United States into World War I. This mattered because it demonstrated a conscious effort to avoid repeating past commitments. At the same time, authoritarian regimes were rising abroad. Adolf Hitler consolidated power in Germany. Benito Mussolini expanded Italian influence. Imperial Japan pursued aggressive expansion in East Asia, including invasion of Manchuria and later China, while the United States condemned these actions diplomatically. Direct military involvement was avoided. The prevailing belief remained that European and Asian conflict should be managed without American intervention. This mattered because isolationism delayed confrontation with emerging threats. Franklin Roosevelt gradually shifted policy as global tensions increased. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and World War II began in Europe, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to modify neutrality laws through a cash-and-carry provision. This allowed nations at war to purchase American goods if they paid cash and transported the materials themselves. In 1941, the Lend-Lease Act expanded support to Allied nations, especially Britain and later the Soviet Union. The United States was not yet formally at war, but it was increasingly aligned with the Allies. This mattered because economic assistance once again connected American stability with the outcome of foreign conflict. Meanwhile, tensions with Japan escalated in the Pacific. American sanctions targeted Japanese access to oil and steel after Japan's expansion into French Indochina. These economic pressures intensified hostility. The situation culminated on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. The attack destroyed or damaged numerous ships and aircraft and killed over 2,400 Americans. This mattered because it eliminated domestic hesitation. Isolationism collapsed almost overnight. The following day, Congress declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States shortly thereafter. The nation that had attempted to remain detached from global conflict now entered the largest war in human history. The next part will examine how World War II transformed the United States from an emerging power into the central architect of the post-war international order. The attack on Pearl Harbor did more than bring the United States into World War II. It initiated the largest mobilization of industrial and military power in American history. Wheaton-Mont's factories that once produced consumer goods shifted to manufacturing tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition. Automobile plants began assembling bombers. Shipyards operated around the clock. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft and over 88,000 tanks. This mattered because industrial capacity became decisive. The war was not won solely on battlefields, but in production lines. American forces engaged on two major fronts simultaneously: Europe and the Pacific. In Europe, U.S. troops landed in North Africa in 1942, advanced through Italy, and then participated in the D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. The invasion opened a Western front against Nazi Germany, accelerating its defeat. In the Pacific, U.S. forces adopted an island-hopping strategy, capturing strategic positions while bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds. Battles such as Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa demonstrated both the scale of the conflict and the intensity of resistance. This mattered because global reach required simultaneous operations across vast distances. The Manhattan Project introduced a new dimension to global power. In August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered shortly afterward, ending the war. The use of nuclear weapons marked the beginning of the atomic age. This mattered because military power now carried unprecedented destructive capacity. The United States emerged from the war not only as a conventional military leader, but as the sole nuclear power, at least temporarily. World War II left much of Europe and Asia devastated. In contrast, the continental United States remained physically intact. Its industrial base was stronger than ever. Approximately half of the world's manufacturing output in 1945 came from the United States. The dollar became central to global finance. This mattered because economic dominance reinforced military strength. The combination positioned the United States at the center of post-war reconstruction. Rather than retreat into isolation, as it had after World War I, the United States took an active role in shaping new international institutions. The United Nations was established in 1945, with the United States as a permanent member of the Security Council. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions designed to stabilize global finance. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, provided over $13 billion in aid to rebuild Western Europe. This mattered because it reflected a strategic shift. Stability abroad was now seen as directly linked to American security and prosperity. However, cooperation with the Soviet Union deteriorated rapidly after the war. Ideological differences between capitalist democracy and communist authoritarianism intensified. By 1947, President Harry Truman articulated a policy of containment, pledging support to nations resisting communist expansion. This marked the beginning of the Cold War. The United States had emerged from World War II not simply as a participant in global affairs, but as one of two dominant superpowers competing for global influence. The transformation from regional power in 1898 to global superpower in 1945 had occurred in less than half a century. Industrial capacity, military projection, nuclear capability, and institutional leadership combined to elevate the United States into unprecedented influence. The next act will examine the Cold War, a conflict defined not by a direct large-scale war between superpowers, but by ideological rivalry, proxy wars, and nuclear deterrence that shaped global politics for nearly 5 decades. By 1947, the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had collapsed into strategic rivalry. The destruction of World War II left a power vacuum in Europe and Asia. The United States and the Soviet Union, representing competing political and economic systems, moved quickly to shape the post-war order in their favor. The Soviet Union established communist governments across Eastern Europe, creating what Winston Churchill described as an Iron Curtain. This mattered because Europe, once the center of global power, was now divided into opposing spheres of influence. In response, President Harry Truman articulated what became known as the Truman Doctrine. In March 1947, he addressed Congress and pledged American support to nations resisting communist subversion or armed minorities. The immediate context was Greece and Turkey, where political instability risked Soviet influence. However, the broader implication was global. The United States committed to a long-term strategy of containment, preventing the expansion of communism rather than directly overthrowing it in established regions. This mattered because it formalized America's role as defender of a particular ideological order. Containment required both military and economic tools. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, aimed to rebuild Western Europe economically to reduce vulnerability to communist influence. Over 4 years, billions of dollars flowed into European reconstruction. Industrial output recovered rapidly. This mattered because economic stability was viewed as a barrier against political radicalization. Containment was not only about military strength, it was about reinforcing democratic systems through prosperity. The Berlin Crisis of 1948-1949 provided the first major test of resolve. When the Western Allies moved to consolidate their zones of Germany and introduce a new currency, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, cutting off land access. Rather than withdraw or confront militarily, the United States and its allies initiated the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, aircraft delivered food, fuel, and supplies to the city's residents. The operation demonstrated logistical capability and political determination. This mattered because it showed that the United States was willing to sustain costly commitments to prevent Soviet expansion without triggering direct war. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) was established. For the first time in peacetime, the United States entered a permanent military alliance with European nations. Article 5 of the NATO treaty declared that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. This was a decisive departure from the pre-World War to avoidance of entangling alliances. This mattered because containment now included formal collective defense. That same year, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. The United States no longer held nuclear monopoly. The balance of power shifted into what became known as mutually assured destruction. Nuclear weapons introduced a new dimension to global rivalry. Direct war between superpowers now risked catastrophic annihilation. This reality shaped every major strategic decision during the Cold War. It mattered because it restrained direct conflict while intensifying competition through proxy wars and technological rivalry. By the early 1950s, the world was clearly divided into two blocks. The United States led a coalition of capitalist democracies. The Soviet Union led a bloc of communist states. The Cold War would not be fought primarily through direct confrontation between Washington and Moscow, but through regional conflicts, intelligence operations, economic competition, and ideological influence. The next part will examine the Korean War, the expansion of containment into Asia, and the global spread of Cold War rivalry. The first major armed conflict of the Cold War erupted not in Europe, but in Asia. After World War II, Korea had been divided along the 38th parallel, with Soviet-backed forces occupying the north and American-backed forces in the south. The division was initially intended as temporary, but ideological differences solidified it into two separate states: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north and the Republic of Korea in the south. This mattered because the Cold War's ideological rivalry had already begun shaping political boundaries beyond Europe. In June 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea in an attempt to unify the peninsula under communist control. The invasion triggered immediate international response. The United Nations Security Council, in the absence of the Soviet representative who was boycotting the session, authorized military assistance to South Korea. The United States led the UN coalition. President Harry Truman framed the intervention as essential to preventing further communist expansion. This mattered because containment was now being enforced through direct military action. Initial North Korean advances pushed South Korean and American forces into a small defensive perimeter near Busan. However, General Douglas MacArthur launched a bold amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950, cutting off North Korean supply lines and reversing the tide of the war. UN forces advanced northward toward the Chinese border. At this point, the conflict expanded further. China entered the war in support of North Korea, sending hundreds of thousands of troops. The war transformed from regional invasion into broader proxy confrontation between communist and Western forces. This mattered because containment had escalated into a costly and prolonged military engagement. By 1951, the front stabilized near the original 38th parallel. Fighting continued for 2 more years, with heavy casualties on both sides. An armistice was signed in July 1953, restoring the division of Korea without a formal peace treaty. The Korean War demonstrated several key features of the Cold War. It confirmed that the United States would commit military resources to defend allied governments. It also demonstrated the limits imposed by nuclear deterrence. Despite possessing atomic weapons, the United States did not escalate to nuclear use against China. This mattered because the war set the pattern for future proxy conflicts. Containment expanded beyond Korea. In 1954, the United States supported the formation of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, aimed at preventing communist expansion in Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, the Central Intelligence Agency conducted covert operations in countries perceived as vulnerable to communist influence, including Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954. These operations sought to remove governments seen as aligning with Soviet interests. This mattered because Cold War rivalry extended into political and intelligence arenas, not just open warfare. At the same time, The arms race intensified. Both the United States and the Soviet Union developed hydrogen bombs, vastly more powerful than the atomic weapons used in 1945. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were developed, capable of delivering nuclear warheads across continents within minutes. Civil defense programs emerged, including fallout shelters and emergency preparedness campaigns. The concept of mutually assured destruction became central to strategic doctrine. This mattered because global superpower status now involved maintaining credible deterrence to prevent catastrophic war. The Korean War globalized containment. It confirmed that the Cold War would not remain confined to Europe. Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America would all become arenas of ideological competition. The next part will examine the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and the escalation of Cold War tensions. During the 1960s and 1970s, by the early 1960s, Cold War tensions reached their most dangerous point. The ideological rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union had already expanded into Europe and Asia, but the confrontation moved dramatically closer to American territory in 1962. After Fidel Castro's revolution in Cuba in 1959, the island nation aligned itself with the Soviet Union. The United States had attempted to remove Castro through the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which weakened American credibility and strengthened Cuba's ties to Moscow. This mattered because Cuba's geographic proximity, only 90 miles from Florida, created direct strategic vulnerability. In October 1962, American reconnaissance flights discovered Soviet nuclear missile installations under construction in Cuba. These missiles would have placed major U.S. cities within immediate striking range. President John F. Kennedy responded by announcing a naval quarantine of Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. Strategic forces were placed on high alert. Military planners prepared for a potential invasion. This mattered because nuclear deterrence, previously theoretical, became immediate and visible. The crisis was resolved through negotiation. The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its missiles from Cuba in exchange for U.S. assurances not to invade the island, and the quiet removal of American missiles from Turkey. The resolution reinforced a key Cold War principle. Direct superpower war must be avoided at almost any cost. The establishment of a direct communication line, the hotline between Washington and Moscow, followed. This mattered because the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated both the extreme risk of escalation and the necessity of controlled diplomacy within nuclear rivalry. While the Cuban crisis ended without war, another conflict escalated in Southeast Asia. Vietnam had been divided after French colonial defeat in 1954. Communist government in North Vietnam sought to unify the country under its control. The United States supported South Vietnam as part of containment strategy. Initially, involvement was limited to advisors and financial support. However, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, Congress passed a resolution granting President Lyndon B. Johnson authority to expand military operations. Large numbers of American combat troops were deployed beginning in 1965. This mattered because containment had now evolved into prolonged counterinsurgency warfare. The Vietnam War presented different challenges from Korea. Guerrilla tactics, jungle terrain, and unclear front lines complicated military strategy. Despite superior firepower, the United States struggled to achieve decisive victory. The Tet Offensive in 1968, although militarily repelled, shifted American public opinion by exposing the war's intensity. Domestic protests increased. Media coverage brought battlefield realities into American homes. This mattered because Cold War policy was no longer insulated from domestic political pressure. By the early 1970s, the United States pursued a strategy of Vietnamization, gradually transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while reducing American troop presence. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords led to U.S. withdrawal. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, unifying Vietnam under communist rule. The outcome raised questions about the limits of American power. This mattered because superpower status did not guarantee success in every regional conflict. Simultaneously, the United States and the Soviet Union entered a period known as détente. Strategic arms limitation talks sought to cap nuclear arsenals. Diplomatic engagement increased. Yet rivalry persisted. The Cold War was entering a new phase, defined by technological competition, economic pressure, and indirect confrontation, rather than an immediate nuclear brinkmanship. The next part will examine how this rivalry intensified in the late Cold War, and ultimately concluded with the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the late 1970s, the Cold War had entered a renewed period of tension after the brief phase of détente. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 marked a turning point. The United States responded by supporting Afghan resistance fighters through covert assistance. This conflict became one of the longest and most costly military engagements for the Soviet Union. It drained resources and exposed internal weaknesses. This mattered because sustained proxy wars placed financial and political strain on both superpowers. But the Soviet system proved less resilient. At the same time, the United States underwent political shifts. President Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, adopted a more confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union. He increased defense spending significantly, supported modernization of nuclear forces, and launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, often called Star Wars, aimed at developing missile defense systems. Critics argued it would escalate tensions. Supporters believed it would pressure the Soviet economy further. This mattered because the Cold War was increasingly shaped by economic capacity as much as military confrontation. The Soviet Union, under leaders such as Leonid Brezhnev and later Mikhail Gorbachev, faced mounting economic stagnation. Central planning struggled to match Western technological innovation. Oil price fluctuations reduced revenue. Consumer shortages and bureaucratic inefficiencies weakened domestic confidence. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he introduced reforms known as glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring. These reforms aimed to revitalize the system, but instead exposed deeper structural weaknesses. This mattered because attempts to reform authoritarian systems sometimes accelerate their as reforms loosened political control. Nationalist movements gained momentum within Soviet republics and Eastern European satellite states. In 1989, a wave of revolutions swept across Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall, long a symbol of Cold War division, fell in November 1989. Communist governments collapsed in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere. The Soviet Union refrained from military intervention, signaling a decisive shift from earlier doctrine. This mattered because containment had achieved its long-term objective without direct superpower war. In December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved. 15 independent republics emerged. The Cold War ended not with nuclear confrontation, but with systemic collapse. The United States remained as the sole global superpower. Its military, economic, and technological capabilities were unmatched. This moment was described by some as a unipolar era. This mattered because for the first time since World War II, there was no peer competitor balancing American influence. However, the end of the Cold War did not eliminate global instability. Instead, it introduced new dynamics. Ethnic conflicts erupted in the Balkans. Regional powers tested boundaries. The absence of a clear rival required redefining American strategy. Containment had shaped foreign policy for nearly half a century. Without the Soviet Union, the United States needed new frameworks for engagement. The next act will examine the post-Cold War world, the war on terror, economic globalization, and the challenges of maintaining superpower status in the 21st century. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the United States emerged as the world's only superpower. For the first time in modern history, there was no comparable rival balancing American military and economic influence. Defense spending, advanced technology, global alliances, and nuclear superiority placed the United States at the center of international decision. This period was often described as a unipolar moment. This mattered because global expectations shifted. Without a competing superpower, American leadership became both more influential and more scrutinized. The first major test of post-Cold War leadership occurred even before the Soviet collapse was complete. In 1990, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The invasion threatened regional stability and global oil supplies. President George H.W. Bush assembled a broad international coalition under United Nations authorization. Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991. Coalition forces expelled Iraqi troops within weeks through coordinated air and ground campaigns. This mattered because it demonstrated American capacity to mobilize multinational military action rapidly in the new geopolitical environment. Unlike previous Cold War conflicts, the Gulf War was not framed as ideological containment against communism. Instead, it emphasized enforcement of international norms and territorial sovereignty. The successful coalition reinforced U.S. credibility and showcased technological superiority, including precision-guided munitions and advanced surveillance systems. This mattered because it illustrated how modern warfare had evolved. Information systems and rapid deployment became central to military effectiveness. During the 1990s, the United States also intervened in regional crises without direct Cold War framework. In the Balkans, ethnic conflict erupted after the breakup of Yugoslavia. NATO, led heavily by the United States, conducted air campaigns in Bosnia and later in Kosovo to halt violence and enforce peace agreements. These interventions were justified on humanitarian grounds, as well as regional stability. This mattered because American foreign policy increasingly incorporated concepts of human rights and international responsibility. At the same time, economic globalization accelerated. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was signed in 1994, deepening economic integration between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The World Trade Organization was established in 1995 to facilitate global trade rules. American corporations expanded internationally, and technological innovation, particularly in computing and telecommunications, transformed global markets. Silicon Valley became a center of digital development. This mattered because economic power reinforced military and diplomatic influence. The United States shaped not only security structures but also global commerce. However, the absence of a superpower rival did not eliminate threats. New forms of conflict emerged, particularly from non-state actors. Terrorist networks, most notably Al-Qaeda, targeted American interests abroad during the 1990s. The bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 and the attack on the USS Cole in 2000 signaled growing danger. These events did not yet redefine American strategy, but they foreshadowed a major shift. The post-Cold War era initially appeared to confirm American dominance. Military coalitions succeeded. Economic globalization expanded. Technological innovation accelerated, yet the assumption of uncontested security would soon be shattered. The next part will examine the attacks of September 11, 2001, and how they reshaped American foreign policy and global engagement in the 21st century. On September 11, 2001, the perception of American security changed abruptly. 19 members of the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda hijacked for commercial airplanes. 2 were flown into the World Trade Center towers in New York City. 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers intervened. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The attacks were coordinated, symbolic, and broadcast globally in real time. This mattered because the United States had not experienced a large-scale attack on its mainland since Pearl Harbor. The sense of geographic invulnerability that had characterized much of the 20th century was shattered. President George W. Bush addressed the nation and framed the response as a war on terror. Unlike previous wars against nations, this conflict targeted non-state actors operating across borders. Congress passed the authorization for use of military force, a UMF, granting broad authority to pursue those responsible. The strategic objective expanded beyond retaliation. It included dismantling terrorist networks, preventing future attacks, and confronting regimes accused of supporting terrorism. This mattered because American foreign policy shifted from containment of rival superpowers to preemptive action against diffuse threats. In October 2001, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda leaders were based under Taliban protection. Within weeks, Taliban control collapsed under combined U.S. air power and local allied forces. However, the conflict did not end quickly. Insurgent activity persisted, and nation-building efforts became central to strategy. Establishing a stable Afghan government proved complex, involving reconstruction, security training, and long-term troop presence. This mattered because superpower status did not guarantee rapid resolution against decentralized insurgencies. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, citing concerns over weapons of mass destruction and alleged connections to terrorism. Saddam Hussein's regime fell quickly, but post-invasion stabilization encountered significant resistance. Insurgency, sectarian conflict, and political instability prolonged American military involvement for years. The failure to find active weapons programs damaged international credibility. This mattered because unilateral action without broad international consensus introduced strain into alliances and reshaped perceptions of American leadership. Domestically, the war on terror led to expanded security measures. The Department of Homeland Security was established. The USA Patriot Act broadened surveillance authorities. Airport security, intelligence, coordination, and counter-terrorism operations intensified. These measures aimed to prevent further attacks, but also sparked debates over civil liberties and executive power. This mattered because superpower responsibilities increasingly intersected with domestic policy. Globally, alliances adapted to new priorities. NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history, declaring the attacks on the United States an attack on all members. Yet long-term commitment to Afghanistan and Iraq tested coalition endurance. Meanwhile, emerging powers such as China expanded economically and technologically, even as the United States focused heavily on Middle Eastern conflicts. This mattered because strategic attention shifted toward counterterrorism, potentially at the expense of preparing for renewed great power competition. The war on terror defined the first 2 decades of the 21st century. It demonstrated American military reach, but also exposed limits of prolonged occupation and counterinsurgency campaigns. The next part will examine how global power dynamics evolved during this period, including the rise of China, renewed Russian assertiveness, and the challenge of maintaining superpower status in a multipolar environment. While the United States concentrated heavily on counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, another transformation was unfolding in the global balance of power. China, which had begun economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s, experienced sustained rapid growth throughout the 1990s and 2000s. After joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, China integrated deeply into global supply chains. Manufacturing capacity expanded dramatically, foreign investment increased, and export-driven growth lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. This mattered because economic power is a foundation of geopolitical influence. As China's economy grew, its strategic ambitions evolved. By the 2010s, China had become the world's second-largest economy. It invested heavily in infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and telecommunications. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, aimed to expand Chinese economic and strategic connections across Asia, Africa, and Europe through infrastructure financing. This initiative extended Chinese influence far beyond its borders. This mattered because global power competition was no longer defined by ideological blocs alone, but by economic integration and technological leadership. Simultaneously, China expanded its military capabilities. The People's Liberation Army modernized naval and missile systems. Artificial islands were constructed in the South China Sea, equipped with runways and military installations. These moves challenged existing regional security arrangements and raised concerns among neighboring countries. The United States responded by reinforcing alliances in the Indo-Pacific region and conducting freedom of navigation operations. This mattered because great power rivalry was re-emerging, though in different form from the Cold War. Russia also reasserted itself on the global stage. In 2008, Russia intervened militarily in Georgia. In 2014, it annexed Crimea from Ukraine and supported separatist movements in eastern Ukraine. These actions signaled a willingness to challenge post-Cold War territorial norms. Western nations imposed sanctions, and NATO reinforced its eastern defenses. This mattered because assumptions of a stable post-Cold War order were being tested. The return of state-centered rivalry required recalibration of American strategy. The United States faced a complex environment. Counterterrorism commitments remained active, yet long-term strategic competition with China and Russia intensified. Defense planning began shifting toward great power competition, emphasizing modernization of naval forces, cyber capabilities, and space systems. Economic policy increasingly intersected with national security concerns, particularly regarding technology transfer and supply chain dependence. Trade disputes and tariffs between the United States and China highlighted tensions extending beyond military domains. This mattered because superpower status now required multidimensional competition across economic, technological, and military arenas. At the same time, domestic political divisions within the United States grew more visible. Debates over globalization, immigration, and foreign intervention influenced electoral politics. Questions emerged about the sustainability of long-term overseas commitments and defense spending levels. Superpower leadership depends not only on external strength but internal cohesion. This mattered because strategic direction can be influenced by domestic consensus or fragmentation. By the late 2010s, the global system appeared less unipolar and increasingly multipolar. The United States remained militarily dominant, but economic and technological competition into the next and final part of this act will examine how recent events, including global pandemics, renewed conflict in Europe, and shifting alliances, continue to shape the United States' role as a superpower in the 21st century. The early 2020s introduced developments that accelerated shifts already underway in global power dynamics. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted international supply chains, strained healthcare systems, and triggered economic contraction worldwide. The United States faced significant domestic impact, including high mortality rates, economic shutdowns, and political debate over public health measures. This mattered because global leadership is tested not only by military conflict, but by crises management. The pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in supply chains, particularly reliance on overseas manufacturing for critical goods. At the same time, technological competition intensified. Semiconductor production, telecommunications infrastructure, artificial intelligence development, and cybersecurity became central strategic concerns. The United States enacted policies aimed at strengthening domestic manufacturing capacity in critical industries, including semiconductor fabrication. Export controls and investment restrictions targeted sensitive technologies. This mattered because economic interdependence, once viewed primarily as stabilizing, became intertwined with national security considerations. In 2021, the United States withdrew its remaining troops from Afghanistan, ending nearly 20 years of military involvement. The rapid collapse of the Afghan government and the return of Taliban control raised questions about the long-term effectiveness of extended nation-building efforts. The withdrawal symbolized a broader strategic pivot, reducing large-scale counterinsurgency commitments to focus on great power competition. This mattered because resource allocation reflects strategic priorities. Ending one prolonged conflict allowed attention to shift toward systemic rivalry. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The conflict reshaped European security calculations. The United States, along with NATO allies, provided military and economic support to Ukraine while avoiding direct combat involvement. Sanctions targeted Russian financial institutions and energy exports. The war revived transatlantic coordination and reinforced NATO's relevance. This mattered because it demonstrated that conventional interstate war in Europe remained possible and that collective defense structures retained significance. Meanwhile, competition with China continued across multiple domains. Tensions over Taiwan increased, Military exercises, diplomatic signaling, and economic measures reflected heightened caution. At the same time, global economic interdependence made complete disengagement unrealistic. The relationship combined competition with selective cooperation on issues such as climate change. This mattered because 21st century superpower rivalry involves complex interconnection rather than total separation. Throughout these developments, the United States retained unmatched global military reach, extensive alliance networks, and technological innovation capacity. However, challenges became more diffuse. Cybersecurity threats, misinformation campaigns, energy transitions, and climate-related disruptions influenced strategic planning. Superpower status in the 21st century requires managing both traditional military balance and emerging non-traditional risks. From 1898 to the present, the United States moved from overseas expansion to World War mobilization, from nuclear deterrence to counter, and from unipolar dominance to renewed great power competition. The arc demonstrates adaptability but also strain. The next act will examine the economic foundations of American power, including finance, energy, and technology, and how these pillars sustain or limit global influence in the decades ahead. Military strength and diplomatic influence depend on economic capacity. From the early 20th century onward, the United States' rise as a superpower has been inseparable from its industrial productivity and financial infrastructure. By the end of World War II, the United States accounted for roughly half of global manufacturing output. Steel, automobiles, aircraft, machinery, and chemicals were produced at scale unmatched by any other nation. This mattered because industrial output determines the ability to sustain prolonged conflict, rebuild allies, and maintain global presence. The foundation for this dominance had been built decades earlier. Through rapid industrialization during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, abundant natural resources, coal, iron ore, oil, combined with expanding rail networks and large domestic markets. The country's geography, protected by two oceans and friendly neighbors, allowed economic development without constant threat of invasion. This mattered because geographic insulation preserved infrastructure during major wars that devastated Europe and Asia. Energy production became another pillar of power. In the early 20th century, the United States emerged as a leading oil producer. Petroleum-fueled naval fleets, mechanized armies, and industrial production. Control over energy supply directly affected military mobility and economic growth. During World War II, American oil output far exceeded that of Axis powers. This mattered because energy sufficiency translated into strategic advantage. In later decades, fluctuations in oil prices and dependence on foreign imports would reshape foreign policy priorities, particularly in the Middle East. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, created a global financial architecture anchored by the US dollar. Under this framework, currencies were pegged to the dollar, which was convertible to gold. Even after the gold standard ended in 1971, the dollar retained its central role in global trade and reserves. The US Treasury market became the primary destination for global capital seeking stability. This mattered because financial centrality amplifies influence. Countries holding dollar reserves indirectly reinforce American fiscal flexibility. American capital markets grew into the largest and most liquid in the world. Stock exchanges in New York facilitated investment on a global scale. Venture capital funding supported technological innovation, especially in computing, biotechnology, and telecommunications. Silicon Valley emerged as a center for entrepreneurship and research. This mattered because economic power shifted from heavy industry toward knowledge-based sectors in the late 20th century. Technological innovation became a defining component of global leadership. Trade policy also influenced economic foundations. After World War II, the United States supported gradual reduction of tariffs through multilateral agreements under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, later replaced by the World Trade Organization. Expanded trade networks increased efficiency but also integrated supply chains across borders. This mattered because globalization enhanced economic growth, while simultaneously increasing vulnerability to disruptions. As later crises would demonstrate, Economic dominance enabled sustained defense spending. The United States consistently maintained one of the largest military budgets in the world, funding research, global bases, and advanced weapon systems. Without strong economic output, such spending would not be sustainable. Thus, economic foundations are not separate from military posture. They enable it. The next pod will examine how technological innovation, research institutions, and higher education systems reinforced American economic and strategic leadership during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. While industrial production defined early 20th century economic strength, technological innovation became the defining feature of American power in the second half of the century. During World War II, federal investment in research accelerated dramatically. Projects such as radar development and the Manhattan Project demonstrated how scientific advancement could shape military outcomes. After the war, the United States institutionalized this model of government-supported research, combined with private sector application. This mattered because innovation became systematic rather than incidental. The Cold War intensified technological competition. The launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957 prompted the United States to expand science and engineering education through initiatives such as the National Defense Education Act. Federal funding for research agencies, including NASA and the National Science Foundation, increased significantly. Universities became central hubs for technological development, producing research that later translated into commercial applications. This mattered because superpower rivalry extended beyond weapons to scientific capability. The development of computing technology illustrates this process clearly. Early computers, originally developed for military and academic purposes, gradually entered private industry. By the 1970s and 1980s, companies such as IBM, Intel, and Microsoft played central roles in personal computing. Silicon Valley, supported by venture capital networks and proximity to research universities like Stanford, became a center of innovation. The Internet, originally developed as ARPANET under the US Department of Defense, evolved into a global communications network. This mattered because digital infrastructure transformed commerce, communication, and military coordination. Biotechnology, aerospace engineering, and telecommunications further reinforced economic leadership. Satellite systems enabled global positioning and real-time data transmission. Aerospace companies maintained leadership in civilian and defense aviation. Pharmaceutical research produced treatments that influenced global health markets. These sectors required sustained investment in education and research institutions. This mattered because knowledge capital became as important as physical capital in sustaining influence. The American higher education system contributed directly to this ecosystem. Universities attracted international students and researchers, creating a global talent pool. Immigration policies, though politically debated, enabled many scientists and entrepreneurs to establish careers in the United States. This flow of talent enhanced innovation capacity. This mattered because demographic and educational dynamics influence long-term competitiveness. However, technological dominance also introduced new vulnerabilities. Cybersecurity threats emerged as digital systems became integral to infrastructure. Intellectual property disputes increased, particularly with rising technological competitors. Dependence on global supply chains for components such as semiconductors exposed potential weaknesses. This mattered because technological leadership requires secure and resilient systems, not merely innovation speed. Throughout the late 20th century and into the 21st, the integration of research institutions, private enterprise, venture capital, and defense funding created a feedback loop reinforcing American power. Military projects often generated civilian applications, and commercial success provided tax revenue and investment for further research. This cycle supported sustained global leadership. The next part will examine financial systems, debt dynamics, and the role of the US dollar in maintaining economic influence, and how these mechanisms both strengthen and constrain long-term superpower status. Beyond industrial production and technological innovation, the United States' global influence rests heavily on its financial architecture. Since the mid-20th century, the US dollar has functioned as the world's primary reserve currency. Central banks hold dollar-denominated assets. International trade, particularly in commodities such as oil, is largely conducted in dollars. This arrangement, sometimes referred to as the petrodollar system, reinforces global demand for U.S. currency. This matters because currency centrality provides structural leverage in international economics. When global trade relies on the dollar, the United States benefits in several ways. First, it can borrow at relatively lower interest rates because demand for Treasury securities remains high. U.S. government bonds are considered among the safest assets in global finance. Second, financial sanctions become a powerful foreign policy tool. Because major transactions often pass through dollar-based systems in American financial institutions, the United States can restrict access to international markets for targeted entities or states. This mattered in cases such as sanctions on Iran and Russia. Financial influence extends beyond traditional military capability. However, reserve currency status also intersects with debt accumulation. Over decades, federal spending on defense, social programs, and economic stimulus has contributed to rising national debt levels. While large economies can sustain significant debt relative to GDP, long-term fiscal imbalance presents potential constraints. Interest payments consume portions of federal budgets that might otherwise fund infrastructure or research. This matters because superpower status requires economic flexibility. Persistent fiscal strain can limit strategic options. The global financial crisis of 2008 tested the resilience of American financial institutions, triggered by collapse in housing markets and complex financial derivatives. The crisis spread rapidly through interconnected banking systems worldwide. The U.S. government intervened through bailouts and stimulus measures to stabilize markets. Although the crisis originated in the United States, the dollar's reserve status paradoxically strengthened as investors sought safe assets. This mattered because even during systemic shock, global capital flowed toward American financial instruments. At the same time, economic interdependence created mutual vulnerability. Major holders of U.S. debt include foreign governments, notably China and Japan. This creates a complex relationship. Foreign creditors depend on stable American markets, while the United States benefits from sustained investment. Tensions arise when trade disputes or geopolitical rivalry intersect with financial ties. This matters because financial dominance does not eliminate interdependence. It receps Italiano. Inflationary pressures, currency competition, and discussions of alternative reserve systems occasionally emerge in global forums. Digital currencies and central bank digital currency experiments introduce additional variables. While no immediate alternative has displaced the dollar's dominance, diversification efforts signal long-term competition. This matters because monetary leadership depends on confidence, instability, transparency, and rule of law. In summary, the U.S. dollar and its associated financial systems extend American influence beyond military alliances. Controlled overpayment networks, sanction mechanisms, and global lending institutions amplifies policy tools. However, debt dynamics and systemic risk require careful management. The next and final part of this act will consolidate how industrial strength, technological innovation, and financial centrality interact to sustain or potentially strain America's superpower position in the coming decades. When evaluating the economic foundations of American superpower status, it is necessary to examine how industrial capacity, technological innovation, and financial dominance operate together rather than in isolation. Industrial production provides tangible output: aircraft, vehicles, infrastructure, and defense systems. Technological ecosystems generate innovation that drives productivity and military advantage. Financial centrality ensures capital flows and fiscal flexibility. The interaction among these pillars creates systemic strength. This matters because global leadership depends on structural integration, not singular dominance in one area. Industrial capacity, though no longer concentrated in heavy manufacturing alone, remains critical. Advanced manufacturing in aerospace, semiconductors, biotechnology, and defense systems sustain strategic autonomy. Recent efforts to reshore key industries reflect recognition that supply chain resilience is part of national security. The pandemic and geopolitical tensions exposed vulnerabilities in reliance on overseas production for essential components. This matters because economic resilience reduces exposure to external shocks. Technological leadership reinforces military and economic influence simultaneously. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cybersecurity, and space systems now shape defense planning and commercial competition alike. Federal investment in research, combined with private sector entrepreneurship, continues to define American innovation capacity. However, maintaining leadership requires sustained education funding, immigration policies that attract skilled labor, and infrastructure modernization. This matters because technological advantage can erode without continuous reinvestment. Financial dominance remains a powerful but delicate asset. The dollar's role in global reserves and trade settlement gives the United States influence beyond its borders. Yet reserve currency status depends on trust and political stability, institutional transparency, and rule of law. Long-term fiscal discipline and effective governance contribute to maintaining confidence. This matters because financial leverage is rooted in credibility. Erosion of confidence can gradually weaken structural advantages. Another dimension is demographic and social cohesion. Economic systems depend on workforce participation, educational attainment, and internal stability. Political polarization, inequality debates, and infrastructure challenges influence economic performance. Superpower status requires not only external strength, but internal sustainability. This matters because prolonged domestic instability can limit strategic projection abroad. Energy independence has re-emerged as a strategic factor. Advances in hydraulic fracturing and shale extraction significantly increased domestic oil and natural gas production during the 2010s. Reduced reliance on foreign energy altered geopolitical calculations. Energy exports strengthened trade balances and diplomatic leverage. At the same time, transitions toward renewable energy introduced new industrial competition. This matters because energy systems underpin both economic growth and foreign policy flexibility. In summary, American economic power rests on interconnected systems. Production, innovation, finance, energy, and human capital. These systems have supported superpower status for over 7 decades. However, they require adaptation to evolving global competition. Economic strength enables military projection, alliance support, and crisis response. Weakness in any pillar affects the whole structure. The next act will examine military structure, alliance networks, and global deployment, analyzing how economic foundations translate into strategic presence across continents and oceans in the 21st century. Military power is the most visible expression of superpower status, but it is not defined solely by the size of armed forces. It depends on global deployment capacity, logistics, alliances, and technological superiority. Since the end of World War II, the United States has maintained an extensive network of overseas bases and forward-deployed forces. This matters because force projection allows rapid response to crises across multiple regions simultaneously. The structure of the U.S. military reflects global reach. It is organized into geographic combatant commands, each responsible for specific regions. Indo-Pacific Command, European Command, Central Command, and others. This framework allows coordinated planning across continents. Naval fleets patrol the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Aircraft carriers serve as mobile air bases, capable of operating without reliance on host nations. This matters because mobility reduces dependence on fixed infrastructure and enhances deterrence. Alliances form another critical component of military posture. NATO remains the most prominent alliance, binding North American and European security. Beyond the Europe, bilateral defense treaties link the United States with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. These agreements provide basing rights, joint training, and shared intelligence. This matters because alliances multiply influence. They extend presence without requiring unilateral occupation. Forward deployment also shapes deterrence. American troops stationed in Europe and Asia serve as both defense forces and political signals. Their presence communicates commitment. In the Indo-Pacific region, naval patrols maintain freedom of navigation through contested waters. In Europe, rotational forces reinforce NATO's eastern flank. This matters because deterrence operates not only through capability but through visible commitment. Logistics and transport infrastructure enable this global posture. Airlift capacity allows rapid movement of personnel and equipment. Sealift capabilities transport heavy equipment across oceans. Prepositioned supplies in strategic locations shorten response times. Without these systems, large-scale deployments would require months rather than days. This matters because speed influences strategic credibility. Technological integration further strengthens military effectiveness. Satellite networks provide communication and surveillance. Cyber units protect digital infrastructure and conduct defensive and offensive operations. Space-based systems enable navigation and missile warning detection. The military increasingly integrates unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, and advanced missile defense technologies. This matters because modern conflict spans multiple domains: land, sea, air, cyber, and space. However, global presence also entails cost. Maintaining overseas bases, conducting joint exercises, and sustaining readiness requires substantial funding. Public debates periodically question the scope of commitments abroad. Strategic planners must balance readiness with fiscal constraints. This matters because superpower posture requires sustained political and economic support. The next part will examine how alliance networks evolved after the Cold War, how NATO expanded, and how partnerships in Asia and the Middle East shaped current strategic calculations. After the Cold War ended, the structure of American alliances did not dissolve. Instead, it expanded and adapted to new realities. NATO, originally created to deter Soviet aggression in Europe, redefined its mission. In the 1990s and early 2000s, several former Eastern Bloc countries joined the alliance, including Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and later the Baltic states. This mattered because NATO enlargement extended collective defense commitments closer to Russia's borders, altering the European security balance. Supporters of expansion argued that integrating post-communist states into Western institutions would stabilize democracy and reduce the risk of regional conflict. Critics, particularly within Russia, viewed expansion as encroachment. The tension between reassurance for new members and deterrence toward Russia became a defining feature of post-Cold War European strategy. This mattered because alliance commitments shaped geopolitical perception. Defensive expansion by one side may be interpreted as strategic pressure by another. Beyond Europe, alliance structures in Asia evolved differently. Unlike NATO's multilateral framework, American alliances in Asia are primarily bilateral. Defense treaties with Japan and South Korea anchor regional stability. U.S. forces stationed in Okinawa and South Korea serve as deterrence against North Korean aggression and as counterbalance to Chinese military growth. This mattered because Asia's security architecture relies on networked partnerships rather than a single unified alliance. In the Middle East, relationships are more complex. The United States maintains close security partnerships with Israel and several Gulf states. Military bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait support operations in the region. These partnerships developed initially in response to Cold War dynamics and later counterterrorism efforts. However, regional conflicts, shifting alliances, and energy considerations complicate long-term commitments. This matters because regional stability often requires balancing multiple actors with competing interests. Coalition building became central during operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. NATO invoked collective defense after September 11th, demonstrating alliance flexibility beyond Europe. However, sustaining multinational participation over extended campaigns proved challenging. Differences in domestic political support and military capability among allies affected operational scope. This mattered because alliance cohesion depends on shared perception of threat and willingness to commit resources. The concept of strategic pivot emerged during the early 2010s, emphasizing increased attention toward the Indo-Pacific region. As China's economic and military influence grew, the United States reinforced partnerships with Australia, India, and Japan through forums such as the Quad. More recently, defense agreements such as AUKUS signaled deeper technological and naval cooperation. This mattered because alliances must adapt to emerging power centers and evolving threats. Alliances extend beyond formal treaties. Intelligence sharing arrangements, such as the Five Eyes partnership among the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, facilitate coordinated surveillance and cybersecurity operations. Joint exercises and interoperability standards ensure that allied forces can operate together effectively. This matters because military effectiveness increasingly depends on network integration. The next part will examine force modernization, defense spending trends, and how emerging technologies, including cyber capabilities and space systems, reshape the structure of military dominance in the 21st century. As global competition intensified in the 21st century, the structure of American military dominance evolved beyond traditional force size. Modernization became central. Aircraft carriers, fighter jets, armored divisions, and nuclear submarines remained critical components, but emerging technologies began reshaping strategic priorities. This mattered because future conflict scenarios increasingly involved domains that did not exist during earlier eras of superpower rivalry. Cyber capabilities became a central pillar of national defense. Military and civilian infrastructure rely heavily on digital networks for communication, logistics, energy management, and financial transactions. Cyber attacks, targeting government agencies, corporations, and infrastructure systems, highlighted vulnerabilities. The establishment of U.S. Cyber Command formalized defensive and offensive cyber operations within military structure. This mattered because cyber warfare can disrupt systems without traditional battlefield engagement. Strategic competition now includes digital intrusion and data manipulation. Space also emerged as a distinct domain of operation. Satellite systems provide navigation through GPS, enable missile warning detection, and support global communication. Recognizing the strategic importance of space assets, the United States established the U.S. Space Force in 2019 as a separate military branch. This decision reflected recognition that adversaries were developing anti-satellite capabilities. This mattered because loss of space infrastructure would significantly impair both military and civilian systems. Artificial intelligence and autonomous systems further transformed military planning. Unmanned aerial vehicles expanded reconnaissance and strike capabilities. Machine learning algorithms enhanced intelligence analysis and predictive modeling. Advanced missile defense systems integrated radar networks and interception technologies. This mattered because technological superiority increasingly depends on speed of innovation rather than sheer manpower. Defense spending trends reflect these priorities. While the United States continues to maintain one of the largest defense budgets globally, allocations increasingly support research and development in advanced systems. Modernization programs include next-generation aircraft, cyber defense platforms, and naval expansion. At the same time, maintaining readiness for conventional operations remains necessary. Balancing legacy systems with emerging technologies presents budgetary and strategic challenges. This mattered because resource allocation decisions influence long-term competitive positioning. Multi-domain operations became a guiding doctrine. Rather than treating land, sea, air, cyber, and space as separate theaters, planners emphasize integrated coordination. For example, a naval operation may rely on satellite data, cyber intelligence, and air support simultaneously. Coordination across domains enhances deterrence and operational flexibility. This mattered because adversaries also pursue cross-domain strategies, requiring adaptable response frameworks. However, modernization is not solely technological. Recruitment, training, and morale influence operational effectiveness. Volunteer-based armed forces require sustained investment in personnel development and retention. Social dynamics, demographic trends, and educational standards affect long-term military capacity. This mattered because technological systems still depend on human operators and strategic decisions. As modernization accelerates, competition with peer adversaries increasingly focuses on speed of adaptation. The next and final part of this act will consolidate how military structure, alliance systems, and modernization efforts collectively shape America's ability to sustain superpower status amid evolving global pressures. When the United States is described as a superpower, the defining feature is not simply the ability to win wars, but the ability to shape outcomes without fighting them. That is the logic of deterrence. Deterrence depends on credible capability, visible readiness, and alliance commitment. Throughout the Cold War, nuclear deterrence prevented direct conflict with the Soviet Union. In the post-Cold War era, deterrence shifted toward preventing regional aggression, protecting trade routes, and maintaining alliance stability. This matters because global leadership is often measured by what does not happen. Invasions deterred, alliances preserved, crises contained. The U.S. military's global basing network and rapid deployment capacity are designed to make deterrence credible. Forward troops and naval patrols communicate commitment. In Europe, NATO deployments reassured allies and complicate hostile calculations. In Asia, carrier groups, air bases, and defense treaties shape strategic planning by regional powers. This matters because deterrence is not purely theoretical. It relies on infrastructure that can be seen and measured. However, deterrence also has limits. The United States has repeatedly encountered asymmetric challenges where technological superiority does not guarantee decisive political outcome. Counterinsurgency campaigns in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq demonstrated that military victory does not always translate into stable governance. Even when battlefield objectives are achieved, long-term stabilization requires political legitimacy, local security capacity, and economic reconstruction. This matters because superpower status is constrained by the complexity of modern conflict. Force can remove regimes, but it cannot automatically create stable institutions. Another limit involves alliance management. Alliances multiply power, but they also require sustained diplomacy. Partners have distinct priorities, domestic politics, and regional concerns. Burden-sharing debates within NATO illustrate ongoing tension about defense spending and commitment levels. In the Indo-Pacific, partners may support U.S. presence while simultaneously maintaining economic ties with China. This matters because alliances are not mechanical instruments. They require continuous negotiation and trust maintenance. The financial cost of global leadership remains substantial. Overseas bases, modernization programs, intelligence networks, and constant readiness require large budgets. Defense spending competes with domestic priorities such as infrastructure, healthcare, and education. Political debates over spending levels periodically intensify, especially when wars appear prolonged or unclear. This matters because global posture depends on domestic consent. Without sustained political support, even strong institutions can face strategic retreat. Modern threats also test military dominance in new ways. Cyber attacks can disrupt infrastructure without conventional military engagement. Space-based assets can be targeted without formal declarations of war. Information warfare can influence domestic cohesion, weakening strategic resolve. These threats do not replace traditional military conflict, but they complicate deterrence by introducing ambiguity. This matters because 21st century competition often operates below the threshold of conventional war. Despite these limits, the United States retains unique advantages. A global alliance network, unmatched power projection, and an innovation system that supports modernization. The military, however, is only one pillar of superpower status. Economic strength, domestic cohesion, and institutional stability remain essential. The next act will examine the internal challenges that influence America's ability to sustain global leadership, including political polarization, demographic shifts, economic inequality debates, and institutional trust. Superpower status is not sustained by external strength alone. It depends on internal stability, political cohesion, and institutional resilience. Throughout much of the 20th century, despite partisan competition, there was broad consensus on core foreign policy objectives: containment during the Cold War, alliance commitments in Europe and Asia, and investment in scientific research enjoyed bipartisan support. In recent decades, however, political polarization has intensified, affecting domestic governance and foreign policy consistency. This matters because strategic continuity strengthens credibility abroad. Polarization manifests in several measurable ways. Legislative gridlock has become more frequent. Budget negotiations often result in temporary funding measures rather than long-term fiscal agreements. Debates over defense spending, trade agreements, immigration, and international commitments are increasingly partisan. This matters because allies and adversaries observe domestic debates closely. Perceived inconsistency can affect confidence in long-term commitments. Trust in institutions has also fluctuated. Public confidence in Congress, media, and other institutions has declined in surveys over time. Elections remain robust and competitive, but disputes over electoral processes have heightened political tension. Stable democratic systems rely on acceptance of procedural legitimacy even during disagreement. This matters because institutional stability underpins economic confidence and alliance reliability. Media fragmentation and digital communication have altered political discourse. Social media platforms enable rapid information distribution, but also amplify misinformation and partisan narratives. Foreign actors have, at times, attempted to exploit these divisions through information operations. This matters because internal cohesion influences external posture. A nation preoccupied with internal conflict may find strategic coordination more difficult. Despite polarization, institutional frameworks remain intact. The Constitution continues to guide separation of powers. Courts adjudicate disputes. Transitions of power occur through established processes. Federalism distributes authority between state and federal governments, providing resilience against centralized disruption. This matters because long-term strength depends on durable institutions rather than momentary political alignment. Economic debates also intersect with political division. Questions surrounding income inequality, healthcare access, education, funding, and infrastructure investment influence fiscal priorities. Superpower status requires balancing defense spending with domestic investment. Public consensus on this balance affects long-term strategic direction. This matters because internal allocation decisions shape external capability. Historically, the United States has experienced periods of significant division, including the Civil War, the Great Depression, and social upheavals of the 1960s. In each case, institutional frameworks ultimately endured. Whether contemporary polarization follows similar patterns of adjustment remains an ongoing question. The next part will examine demographic shifts, immigration patterns, and workforce dynamics that influence economic and military sustainability in the coming decades. Long-term superpower status depends heavily on demographic trends and workforce capacity. Population growth, age distribution, educational attainment, and labor force participation influence economic productivity and military recruitment. The United States historically benefited from relatively strong population growth compared to other developed nations. Immigration contributed significantly to this expansion, supplying labor, entrepreneurship, and scientific talent. This mattered because demographic vitality supports economic dynamism. In recent decades, however, demographic patterns have shifted. Birth rates have declined, mirroring trends seen in many advanced economies. An aging population increases pressure on social programs such as Social Security and Medicare, potentially affecting fiscal flexibility. As the ratio of working-age individuals to retirees narrows, tax revenue growth may slow relative to expenditure demands. This matters because fiscal sustainability influences defense budgets and investment in research and infrastructure. Immigration policy plays a central role in demographic balance. Skilled immigrants contribute to technology sectors, healthcare, engineering, and academia. Many high-growth companies in the United States were founded or co-founded by immigrants or their descendants. At the same time, immigration remains politically contentious. with debates focusing on border security, labor market impact, and cultural integration. This matters because workforce expansion and innovation capacity often correlate with openness to global talent flows. Education systems further shape long-term competitiveness. Higher education institutions remain globally influential, attracting students worldwide. However, disparities in primary and secondary education quality affect workforce preparedness. Access to STEM education, vocational training, and higher education affordability influence the pipeline of skilled labor. This matters because technological leadership requires consistent development of expertise. Military recruitment trends also reflect demographic realities. Volunteer armed forces depend on a steady supply of qualified applicants. Physical fitness standards, educational requirements, and public perception of military service influence recruitment rates. As the eligible population changes, maintaining force readiness may require policy adjustments. This matters because defense capability is directly tied to personnel sustainability. Urbanization patterns and regional economic differences add complexity. Technology-driven growth often concentrates in metropolitan areas, while other regions may experience industrial decline or slower development. Economic disparities can influence political polarization and social cohesion. This matters because domestic stability supports consistent foreign policy engagement. At the same time, the United States retains demographic advantages relative to several peer competitors, experiencing sharper population decline. Flexible labor markets and cultural diversity can foster adaptability. However, long-term planning remains essential to sustain growth and competitiveness. The next part will examine economic inequality, infrastructure modernization, and how domestic investment priorities shape strategic capacity in the coming decades. Economic strength at the national level does not automatically translate into uniform prosperity. Over recent decades, economic inequality in the United States has become a central subject of debate. Income and wealth concentration increased significantly from the late 20th century onward, particularly in technology and financial sectors. While aggregate GDP continued to grow, wage growth in certain sectors lagged behind productivity gains. This mattered because sustained inequality can influence social cohesion, political polarization, and long-term economic mobility. Access to education, healthcare, and housing shapes workforce productivity. Regions experiencing deindustrialization often faced employment declines and slower income growth. At the same time, high-growth metropolitan areas saw rising costs of living, particularly in housing markets. These dynamics created regional disparities in opportunity. This matters because superpower sustainability depends on broad-based economic participation. If growth concentrates too narrowly, domestic tensions can increase. Infrastructure modernization presents another strategic challenge. Transportation systems, energy grids, broadband networks, and water systems form the backbone of economic productivity. Much of America's infrastructure was constructed during the mid-20th century. Aging bridges, highways, and public transit systems require significant investment. Delays in modernization can reduce efficiency and increase vulnerability to disruption. This matters because infrastructure directly supports industrial output, military logistics, and technological integration. Energy transition adds complexity to infrastructure planning. The United States remains a major producer of oil and natural gas, contributing to energy independence. At the same time, renewable energy expansion and grid modernization require capital and coordination. Climate-related events, including hurricanes, wildfires, and flooding, impose additional strain on infrastructure systems. This matters because resilience to environmental disruption influences economic stability. Fiscal priorities reflect trade-offs. Defense spending, entitlement programs, and infrastructure investment compete within federal budgets. Policymakers must balance short-term demands with long-term competitiveness. Investments in research, transportation, and education often yield returns over decades rather than electoral cycles. This matters because strategic foresight requires sustained commitment beyond immediate political time. Technological transformation also reshapes labor markets. Automation and artificial intelligence may increase productivity, but can displace certain occupations. Workforce retraining and education reform become essential to prevent structural unemployment. This matters because economic adaptability determines whether technological change strengthens or destabilizes domestic capacity. Despite these challenges, the United States retains advantages: a large internal market, entrepreneurial culture, flexible labor systems, and strong capital markets. Addressing inequality in infrastructure modernization effectively could reinforce economic resilience. The final part of this act will consolidate how political cohesion, demographic sustainability, and economic balance together influence the long-term trajectory of American superpower status. When the United States became a global superpower in the 20th century, it did not do so solely through victories in war or overseas expansion. It did so because internal capacity supported external projection. Industrial production, technological innovation, and financial strength were rooted in domestic stability, functioning institutions, population growth, workforce development, and infrastructure capable of sustaining large-scale mobilization. This matters because the long-term future of American superpower status will be determined as much by internal trends as by external rivals. Political polarization affects strategic consistency. Allies rely on predictable commitments, particularly in treaty obligations and security partnerships. When domestic politics produces abrupt shifts in policy direction, international confidence can weaken. This does not automatically end leadership, but it complicates planning for both partners and adversaries. This matters because credibility is a strategic asset. It is reinforced when commitments appear durable across administrations. Demographic trends shape economic and military sustainability. An aging population increases fiscal pressures, potentially limiting discretionary spending. Immigration, education systems, and labor force participation influence whether the United States maintains a large, skilled workforce capable of sustaining innovation. This matters because technological and industrial leadership depend on human capital, not only financial resources. Economic inequality and regional disparities influence social cohesion. When large segments of the population perceive opportunity as limited, political tension increases and institutional trust may decline. Infrastructure modernization affects productivity and resilience against disruption. If energy grids, transportation networks, and digital systems weaken, both economic performance and military logistics suffer. This matters because superpower status requires redundancy and resilience in domestic systems. The historical record shows that the United States has faced internal crises before and still maintained global influence. The Great Depression was followed by mobilization and world leadership. The social turbulence of the 1960s did not prevent Cold War competition. The key factor in each period was institutional endurance and capacity for adaptation. This matters because adaptation is often the decisive difference between sustained power and decline. In the 21st century, the external environment is more complex than in the immediate post-Cold War era. Great power competition has returned, but it operates across technology, supply chains, and information systems rather than only military confrontations. Domestic resilience becomes even more important under these conditions. A strong internal foundation makes external competition manageable. A weakened internal foundation amplifies external pressure. This matters because rivals often seek to exploit internal division rather than confront military power directly. By this point in the story, we have traced America's rise as a superpower across wars, alliances, financial systems, and shifting global threats. The final act will close the narrative by summarizing the full arc from 1898 to the present and offering a clear factual conclusion about what makes a superpower and what determines whether it remains one. When the United States entered the Spanish-American War in 1898, it did not yet see itself as a global superpower. It was an industrializing republic that had recently completed continental expansion. Its navy was growing, but its foreign commitments were limited. The acquisition of overseas territories marked the first shift outward. From that point forward, each major global event accelerated the country's transformation. World War I demonstrated the United States' ability to project force across the Atlantic and influence European outcomes. Although it retreated from formal League of Nations membership, its economic power remained central to Reconstruction. World War II completed the transition. Industrial mobilization, nuclear capability, and institutional leadership through the United Nations. And Bretton Woods architecture placed the United States at the center of global governance. By 1945, superpower status was not theoretical. It was measurable in production, military reach, and financial dominance. The Cold War defined the next half-century. Containment required sustained alliance systems, nuclear deterrence, technological competition, and proxy conflicts. The Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union demonstrated both the risks and resilience of this strategy. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the United States emerged as the only global superpower, combining military supremacy with economic centrality. The post-Cold War period introduced new challenges. The Gulf War illustrated coalition leadership. The War on Terror redefined security priorities and exposed the limits of prolonged counterinsurgency campaigns. Meanwhile, globalization integrated supply chains and expanded technological influence. As China rose economically and Russia reasserted regional ambitions, the international system shifted toward renewed great power competition. Throughout this arc, certain structural features remained consistent: geographic insulation, energy capacity, innovation ecosystems, deep capital markets, and extensive alliance networks. These features reinforced one another. Economic strength enabled defense spending. Technological leadership enhanced military capability. Financial centrality provided leverage in global crises. Domestic institutions, though periodically strained, preserved continuity of governance. This mattered because superpower status is cumulative. It develops from layered advantages rather than single victories. However, history also shows that power is not static. Industrial leadership can shift. Demographic advantages can narrow. Political cohesion can weaken. This story from 1898 to today illustrates both expansion and recalibration. Each generation confronted new threats, adjusted strategy, and redefined national priorities. The question is not whether the United States once became a superpower. That is established. The relevant question is how long structural advantages can be sustained amid internal and external pressures. The final part will conclude with a clear assessment of what ultimately determines superpower longevity and close with a guided reflection. From 1898 to the present, the rise of the United States as a global superpower followed a measurable progression. Overseas expansion created forward positions. World wars accelerated industrial mobilization and institutional leadership. The Cold War required long-term alliance commitments and nuclear deterrence. The post-Cold War period tested adaptability against terrorism, economic globalization, and renewed great power competition. Each phase added structural layers to American influence. A superpower is defined not only by military strength, but by integrated capacity. Economic output must support defense budgets. Financial systems must sustain investment. Innovation must produce technological advantage. Alliances must extend influence without constant unilateral intervention. Domestic institutions must remain stable enough to coordinate long-term policy. When these pillars operate together, superpower status becomes durable. When one weakens significantly, overall influence becomes harder to maintain. History shows that military victories alone do not secure dominance. After World War I, the United States demonstrated power but hesitated to institutionalize leadership. After World War II, it built institutions that extended influence for decades. During the Cold War, deterrence prevented direct confrontation while economic and technological competition shaped outcomes. In the 21st century, power competition increasingly spans supply chains, cyber networks, energy systems, and technological ecosystems. This means future influence will depend less on battlefield scale and more on systemic resilience. Domestic cohesion remains a decisive variable. Political polarization, demographic shifts, and economic inequality. Influence. Long-term stability. Superpower longevity requires adaptability. The capacity to reform institutions, modernize infrastructure, and invest in education and research. External rivalry intensifies pressure, but internal management determines response. The historical pattern suggests that renewal, when achieved, often follows periods of strain. The United States today remains one of the most militarily capable, economically influential, and technologically advanced nations in the world. It maintains extensive alliances, global basing networks, and central financial leverage. Yet, global power is increasingly distributed. Emerging economies, technological competitors, and regional conflicts complicate the strategic landscape. The next decades will test whether institutional adaptability can sustain leadership in a multipolar environment. If you found this full historical walkthrough valuable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Long-form structured analysis depends on engaged viewers. In the comments, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. And based on everything we covered, do you believe the United States is strengthening its superpower position, maintaining it, or gradually facing structural decline?